and welcome to the third session today. And this is panel on biases, ethics, and predilections in the age of ML. And we have a great panel of experts here with us. Let me introduce our speakers. It's Dr. Angelica Aviles-Rivero, and she's currently a senior research associate in theoretical physics at the University of Cambridge. She's affiliated with the Cambridge Mathematics of Information in Healthcare, the CANTEP Capital Institute for the Mathematics of Information, statistical. And Angelica's research lies at the intersection of computational mathematics and machine learning for applications to large-scale real-world problems. And Angelica focuses on development of new data-driven algorithmic techniques that allow computers to gain high-level understanding from vast amounts of data. And the next expert here is Miri Zilka. And Miri is a Liverhulme Research Fellow in the Machine Learning Group at the University of Cambridge, a college research associate at King's College, and an associate fellow at the Liverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. And she works on trustworthy machine learning with a focus on the deployment of algorithmic tools in criminal justice. And the third expert, Professor Mario Figueiredo, distinguished professor and PhD professor of machine learning, as well as head of the Lisbon unit for learning and intelligence systems at Instituto Superior Técnico, coordinator of information and data science thematic line and pattern recognition and automatic learning research cluster at Instituto de Telecommunications. And Mario's main research focus encompasses the development of the application of machine learning techniques for practical problems, including image and signal processing, information theory, and optimization. And his recent work dwells into the ethics and fairness aspects of machine learning, as well as feature selection, particularly in application like cancer detection using microarray data, malware detection, and fraud detection. So I suggest to split our panel today on three parts. The first part is about what are biases, where do they come from, and the second part about what problems these biases cause, and then the third part, how we can mitigate these risks of making decisions from biased systems. And I also suggest that we will have a Q&A after every part, not during our current discussion. So the first question, then let's start about discussing what do you think is the major source of biases and what are the most important biases we have right now in our machine learning systems? Yeah.
First of all, thanks for the question. So I believe that, first of all, everyone in the community assumes that data is the first one that you have biases and assume that exists. This is a major source of challenging when developing machine learning technologies. So for instance, let me give you an example about data bias. So you go, for instance, healthcare to the hospital, then you're training a model, and then this model only going to learn with this particular demographic population. And the question is, what is happening if you want to extrapolate to a different geographical locations? There is an inherent data bias there. But of course, there are different types of bias as well. You have bias sampling when you are sampling your data as well. So I believe that all of these biases are major challenges. We assume that exists. There is no way that your data is free biases. This is related data, but and this has to deal with, for instance, related about your model, what is learning, if you're learning out of distribution, for instance, and something quite important that is labeling. Labeling is made by humans, particularly, for instance, in sensitive domains like healthcare. A single is different to label a cat and dog, that label, for instance, a chest X-ray, where you need expert knowledge. So there is a high uncertainty on this labeling, yielding to bias in the labeling. So I will say that, long story short, you have bias in the data, bias in your algorithmic development, but at the same time also, well, bias itself on all your labels and on the uncertainty that is inherent to your algorithmic approach. How to deal with that? This is an open question in the community, and there are different ways to do it, but I will stop here to share also as well answers with other panelists.
Thank you. I think I just want to add, because you asked about the source of bias, and I completely agree with you, but I would say that the source of bias is society, and it tends to be reflected in our data. But what happens is that sometimes when it gets coded into machine learning, it can sort of amplify the things that are already happening in ways that are against our intention to progress as society. So you're putting something in place sometimes. So I think one example, this is a bit old example now, but when people started to look into algorithms for hiring, so things like automatic analysis of CV. So I think one of the hopes was actually to get rid of sort of human biases. But because of imbalanced data set and the training process, actually those algorithms ended up being more explicitly biased than a human recruiter would be by penalizing CVs that had the word woman or a women's club, or even going like a level higher. And if you went to a women's only college, you will get penalized. So it becomes sort of more amplified and even more direct.
Thank you. So I'm not going to define again what bias is, but let me, a bit controversially, maybe say something positive about bias. So the fact that we're having this discussion is because when people started using machine learning to take decisions that affect people, we realized that there was bias. And so bias became the focus of a lot of discussion. And so if machine learning had not been biased in the beginning to begin with, maybe these biases already existed in society. And if it didn't amplify, like Miri said, maybe the bias would have gone unnoticed. And so it's good that we're having this discussion. And this discussion now is very present in the community. And so it made biases that were already there much more visible and much more discussed, because people tend to be a lot less forgiving regarding decisions made by machine than maybe people. A good example of that is self-driving cars. Like when there's an accident with a self-driving car, it makes the news, right? But when there's an accident by human driver, it's just a common thing. There's hundreds of them every day. And so we have a very, very critical focus on artificial systems that are trying to make decisions. And so the fact that they were shown to be biased brought the attention to the problem of bias and fairness, which I think is a sort of maybe for the wrong reasons, but a good consequence of the fact that these systems have biases.
So as I've sources of bias, the first one we've said that we have some bias in the data, like bias from society, from opinions, and another bias in like methodology, or like we gather data. Are these data balanced or not balanced? Like how do you think, which one is it like more frequent and more important? And if these like bias from society should we take into account or not as a machine learning practitioners? If we have only like task to have a correct model, so if we have proper input data, properly labeled, without any like biases internal into our methodology, we will get a perfect model. But this perfect model, almost perfect model, still might be biased because our initial data, even if they were perfectly cooked, still has this bias. So how we can handle this situation? Should we also, as ML researchers, think not only about our own stuff, like about our own methodology, but also think about the nature of the data? What do you think?
Thanks for this question. I have an example. My work is focusing on sort of algorithms and machine learning systems deployed in the criminal justice system. So one of the very common examples is something called recidivism predictor, which means that is an algorithm that's meant to predict whether someone who is already in court, if you release them, if you give them bail, are they going to re-offend? Now, the data that's used to train this model has several things, but predominantly it's based on arrest. So we're using arrest as a proxy for crime. Now, it's the only thing you have. We cannot measure crime. That's, I mean, you can measure victimhood, which is also some sort of proxy, but you cannot measure crime directly. But the problem is that given a crime was committed and individuals' chances to be arrested for it depends on who you are. Depends on your age, depends on your gender, depends on your race, depends on where you live. And to be honest, it also depends on whether or not you're a good criminal or not. So this is a very bad proxy or a very biased proxy, but the algorithms that are trained on it are also validated on the same arrest data. So as you said, you can have a system and you can go, look, we have this algorithm that predicts reoffending, and it's got, let's say it's not that high, but let's say it has 80%, it works. But you validated it on the same bias data they used to train. So the accuracy you measure is only within that bias. Now, given that it's hard to impossible to measure anything else, I think at that point you have to ask yourself, is this a question I want to use machine learning to try and answer? Given that this is the best data I can get, it's just, that's the best measure.
Yeah.
Yes, so I would like to divide the response because I believe you have two questions. The first one is, which bias is more important? So I would say that from my personal point of view, all bias are important, from data, algorithmic development, labeling, because all of that is related. So for the first question, I will say, personally, I believe that all type of bias, this is what the community wants to do, improve all that, so you have a more reliable, robust, and fair model. And I believe the community here is more related to physics, that also as well, for instance, machine learning is not only about, for instance, domains like healthcare, but also as well PDEs that open a great door to solve in a more efficient way a problem that we know for many years in mathematics like PDEs. So, but still we have this bias. And I believe for the first part, again, all type of bias, labeling, data, and algorithmic bias are really relevant. However, as was mentioned before by Mario, a good positive thinker bias, and many paper has been shown, we want inductive bias. So you want to force a model that actually the optimal that you will find is not the only one. You want to push the model also as well to have this inductive bias that somehow has been found to be beneficial. So this is beneficials of the biases. And for the second question, the second part that it was in the question here is related about how we can handle this bias. And this is actually a big question in the community, because these three major parts, labeling bias, algorithmic bias, and data bias itself is a huge open to different research that needs to be considered, like from data biases, that as I mentioned before, for instance, change of a geographic population that you cannot capture this distribution and then test all around the world. So this is one part, algorithmic development, even in labeling. You mentioned that what about labels are perfect? I believe that this is far from being true. Labels are really one of the holy grails in machine learning, because at the end of the day, particularly deep learning is all about data driving, and labeling is time consuming, costing. So we also, the community accepts that there is some level of bias in the labeling. So this is my answer for that.
Yeah, I agree with what was said before. I have a certain difficulty in splitting algorithmic bias from data bias, because it's not clear where the algorithm finishes and the data begins on. It depends on how you do the split, I guess. The algorithm I tend to see, because that's where I come from optimization and from like basic math. If you include in the algorithm the design, was very bias sort of in general would be something like deviation from fairness, and there are different measures. Hundreds of papers about measures of how to assess fairness and different measures of fairness. So these are all difficult questions to ask in a very concrete way. But I think it's very important to look at them.
But
maybe there are some cases I haven't found them yet, but it's positive bias where actually say unprivileged groups of society are benefited by some sort of bias. That happened. It was not designed into the algorithm, but turned out to actually happen. Maybe that would be a good outcome of a bias decision.
Can I just add something? I think one of the things that is usually not considered within the algorithmic fairness community is that sometimes you can make a lot of difference. If you can't impact your data, if you can't like rid of the biases, you can still make a difference if you're actually changing your question. So going back to the example of going, instead of asking, oh, which one of you is going to get rearrested again in 2 years? If we ask the question, oh, what support measure can I give this person to reduce their chance of arrest? Then by changing the question and turning it around, you can make the outcome more fair, even if your data is still biased.
Yeah. But we also have, returning back to the question of fairness, and that it's hard to define fairness. But maybe it's not in all cases we have this fuzziness around fairness, because in some cases, if we have problems with data and data are biased because they are not aligned with the real world distribution, like then we don't need like fairness in terms of like definition. We don't need to define fairness, because then we will deploy this system and it will see real data distribution. Then we will see like the bias in the way the system makes predictions. I mean, this example from the previous session where you have cows on the grass on the grasses environment and camels on the sand environments. But if you then deploy the system trained on this data in some other situation where background is the same, then the system will not work because of the bias in the input data. Input, like training distribution, do not matches like distribution which is expected during deployment of the system.
So if I understood what you were saying is that if you won't have bias, if you have perfect observation about the distribution of the population, and that bias comes from a partial observation.
Yeah.
But I would say that a decision-making process, a decision-making machine, or even a human, even if it knows perfectly well the distribution, say the conditional distribution of what is unknown given what you observe, That's not enough to make a decision. You have a loss function that you need to minimize the expected value of. And so for the same distribution, depending on which loss function you choose, what you value, you take to put or to take away bias from a decision-making system is what loss. And I'm not talking about the loss function in training. I'm talking about the loss function at decision time. Once you already have the posterior distribution of whatever is unknown, and you have something that measures consequences of your decision, and you want, that's the classical Bayesian decision theoretic way of making decisions. What are you going to maximize or minimize? So that's, even you have a perfect knowledge of all the statistics of the world, which even though by you can choose different things that maximize different utilities or minimize different losses, and some of them may be seen as unfair and others not, depending on who you want.
So my understanding with is there sometimes biases that, we don't want to change because they do represent sort of something in the real world. And I have an example for that as well. So if I know there's some police forces that sort of try and predict the number of incoming calls, sort of the 999 people that report, and sort of predict that, based on that, having the right number of officers in the right place. And I think that's an example that you could definitely have the different neighborhoods have different amount of calls, and they need different ready officers. And that is not something you want to fix, right? It wouldn't be, you wouldn't socially consider it more fair to have like the same amount to everyone, because they have different needs. So I think that's an example where it's true. But if you turn the problem around, and if you say, oh, we are proactively deploying police to places, and we're proactively doing it to certain neighborhoods because we want to police them more, then you're starting to, you can ask like fairness questions. So I think it is very context dependent, and it is also very dependent on sort of the agreed society moral code, which is not always very much agreed upon. So you do have a lot of sort of gray areas, but I think there are examples where you definitely don't want to touch it. You're like, okay, this represents reality and we don't want to change it within our system. And there are some places where most people will be like, no, this is pretty clear that this is not a phenomena we want to reproduce within our systems.
Yep.
Thank you. So I would like to start with the first part of your question about, do we need fairness for if we know that the data is biased? I would say yes, it's important, because in machine learning, even if we have, everyone have the assumption that we have biases in the different levels, is one of the most important things is monitorize it. Make sure that all your system is fair and robust, reliable. So I believe that we need fairness. I believe, personal opinion, yes. And the second part is, you said, okay, we have this example of like horses and camels, I believe. And you said, okay, there is biases, the background is different, but perhaps your class that you want to classify is the same. Like, let's say horses under different backgrounds, what we can do. This is what we call out of distribution. And this is a measure in no matter which domain we are talking about. Healthcare, we can start analyzing healthcare, satellite, remote sensing data, all type of data, is how we can deal with this nature of out of distribution of all the data. Even if it's the same, like a category that you are looking at, we cannot assume that the distribution of all your data sets are going to be perfect. So, and this is an area that is called domain generalization, how we can make more generalizable machine learning with taking into account and controlling this bias. So this is
Okay.
Sorry, I would just want to add one thing. One thing to keep in mind as well is that sometimes there's certain types of fairness measures that are not actually legal. So if you, for example, say Department of Engineering, University of Cambridge, now decided that it's only recruiting 50-50 male and female students because they want to be fair, that's illegal, because that is legally discrimination, because you will be, if your candidates are in balance, if you're natural, so if you do not have 50-50 equally qualified female and male candidates, and you do still want to get 50-50, so they get different thresholds, that's legally discriminative. So there's also this tension between the legal definition of discrimination and what we would consider sort of algorithmically fair sometimes, that is not always trivial to resolve.
Okay, great. I see that we discussed so many subtle details of what are biases, but maybe if someone has its own idea about source of biases which we have not discussed, or any question about this part, yes, please.
Thank you. One of the things I don't think you've discussed yet is the inherent bias that you get once you've just got a 2x2 contingency table, because all our probabilities are created from a collective point of view, and you can't have a collective fairness of groups and an individual level fairness unless the groups are 50-50. It's just a mathematical constraint. So we've got to be quite careful about managing expectations, because that we've got to decide, are we going to apply this at a category level, which may be appropriate to policy, or in a court, where you probably ought to be more individually fair. And so you've got to decide where it's applied and how it's been sourced. And that's one bias we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah, I can just want to say that the one thing, I mean, you're right, that's kind of what I was alluding to just now, but I think one measure that you do have within legislation to help this is something called positive action. So you cannot apply different thresholds to different individuals based on protected characteristics, but you can offer historically underrepresented minority extra support to help get them in the same place. So you can sort of sometimes build a system where you have both. So you're applying the individual fairness to the decision-making system, but you're also trying to pursue a more group fairness goal using these type of measures.
Yeah, so yes, though, as you mentioned, there can be a conflict between individual fairness and group fairness. Actually, you can show it mathematically, right? And they are well defined. So just as you cannot do machine learning without inductive bias, you cannot do fair decisions without bringing in some notion of what you mean by fair. And some of the notions are incompatible, so you cannot have a system that satisfies all the notions of fairness. That's just a fact. Yeah. Totally agree. Yeah.
Yes, I actually joined the thoughts here. I mean, there is a trade-off, right? Like, we cannot imagine perfect algorithm development machine learning, and at the time fulfill perfectly all the major areas that are now a big question, like ethical approvals, biases, and everything. So we need to find, and the best that we can do is like try our best to have a trade-off on all that area. But yeah, we assume that we cannot get the perfect world. Yeah.
Yeah. So now let's transition to the next stage of our discussion about like what are the major problems these biases can cause us in decision-making processes, like in healthcare, in like criminal justice, or in any other fields. So how you can identify what are the most important things we should look at when we certainly we should expect that any real-world system will have some biases inside it. And so what are the major risks and what are the major problems?
First of all, definitely is very important to monitorize biases, because that has consequences. If, for instance, your data is highly biased, we assume that there is a bias, but it's really, really high bias, and your labeling is biased, that means that your predictions that you are having is wrong. Let me put an example. We are in healthcare, and then labeling is highly uncertain. Again, it's different to label cats and dogs, because you need domain expert, and then a single label, majority of the time you need to recall at least 2 experts. So you assume that you have a high bias. So what you can do in this case, the protocol that you can follow is, first of all, make sure that actually your data that you have is what is so-called curated. as much as possible. Monitorize is quite important on that. Monitorize as well the label as well. And then we can enter or open the door to say, what is the level of label that we need? And this is open the door to different paradigms in machine learning, that is learning without labels or with minimal labels, that for many domains like healthcare, for instance, PDs and so on, you have a scarcity of data, how you can do the best to take advantage of this data and not considering as much as possible the label. So I will say that important protocols are monitorizing transparency in the algorithmic development. This is another one, and particularly also as well in data privacy. So there is a big question in the community to say, well, we now have what are so-called foundational models. As you hear in the previous panel, ChatGPT, many other foundational models. What are the bias? The community wants to know how they were trained. Is there any fairness biases? What are the biases in there? So I believe that a key word here is monitorizing your data, curated very well, monitorizing also as well your algorithm development is crucial here as a protocol.
And just you said ChatGPT, and there was a very recent work by some Stanford researchers that tried to see what LLMs say when you ask them questions about racial medicine. I'm going to give you the preview. It wasn't very good. And there was like a 5 questions list, and one of them, all the models answered well. So I feel like that was a question that clearly somebody has picked up and like trained them. But it's just, it can be incredibly hard to weed out everything. But sorry, that was just a comment you give me. Going back to the original question. So I think for me, one of the biggest concerns I have that sometimes, because of there's awareness for algorithmic bias, people can sometimes do some checks and then kind of check a box and have the veneer of fairness, where they've only convinced themselves that their system's not biased because they looked at it through quite a narrow window. And I think that can be really problematic. So that can be really problematic. For example, if you're looking at outcomes in a very narrow window, if you're sort of checking something and you're like looking at a 12 weeks window, but not checking if it's still the same in 6 months or a year, or if you're looking at a very specific decision, but not the context around it, and you're like, oh, we're being fair in that decision, but actually the things that's leading up to it or the things coming after it is not. So you kind of have to be, I think, very careful when you're looking at something to not measure things on one specific metric, and to be always related to like the domain context and like the flow of what happens before and after the decisions. I think one example, again, sorry, all my examples of criminal justice, but you can think about releasing people from prison. And so you can monitor that. You can monitor things like age, race, gender, people released from prison. And you can maybe demonstrate, oh, we're doing this fairly, we're releasing the same amount. But what if, you know, a proportion of them is coming back to prison 6 months later or 4 months later, and that proportion is not equal? Then whatever measures you take in aren't necessarily fair. They're just fair in that point in time that you looked at and through that metric and lens that you looked at. But you get the veneer of fairness because you're like, look, what we're doing isn't biased.
Yeah, so actually continuing in that trend, so one very important aspect that especially, well, I have some work like mentioned on fraud detection, mostly in online banking operations and credit card transactions. And one very important thing to keep in mind, because those decisions affect people, because if you have some transaction blocked, it's bad. It's not as bad as going to prison, but it's bad. And there are distribution shifts, not only because society evolves, but also because there's adversarial attacks. So there's always fraudsters trying to trick the system, which makes, and the positive class is very rare. So it's a very low prevalence problem. And these shifts can affect the fairness in the system. And it's not easy to monitor how this fairness is evolving. And so you have to, it's a hard problem so the main lesson would be companies that use AI decision-making systems that affect people should be aware of that, should monitor, should be very, should have that word in their minds all the time. Especially in the one case I know well, not criminal justice, I don't know so well. But in this case, keeping in mind that this is an adversarial scenario, and these adversarial distribution shifts can have very strong effects on fairness, because that's precisely one of the angles from which fraudsters will try to attack, is by exploring some sort of biases in the decision-making system. So there are sometimes subtle and unexpected angles in these how things change across time and how it affects fairness.
I have a question which maybe treats biases and fairness from slightly another angle. So as fairness is very important in real-world applications, do you know any cases when people try to undermine application of some AI system by claiming that they are not fair, but they were really like objectively fair and good systems, but someone tries to attack a specific application by claiming that this system is unfair, and how this might be settled then in this case?
Well, perhaps one of the examples that could be aligned with your question is about, for instance, the so-called benchmark in machine learning. Some of them are good controversy a few years ago about all of these, like for instance, generating faces, generating everything. They are biased towards a particular demographic population. So of course, the community does try, the machine learning community, one of the major goals is like how we can create this data so we can test models. So the community create these so-called data sets with a certain demographic population that it was to start an initial point for data creation. However, the controversy was like, this is not fair because it's only tackling a particular demographic population. It was not on purpose, but the solution is, okay, we need a new data set that cover a wide range of demographic population. And this is a way that is solved. More and more the communities are developing more data sets that are more reflecting in actually what is the real world, all populations and demographic. That's one example that can come to my mind. Yeah.
So I don't know of any exact example of exactly what you said, but I do have something where I think there can be a disagreement about what is fair in a certain context. So one of the things that people often talk about as a good thing with algorithmic decision making is consistency. But consistency is not always desirable. So if we think, for example, about judges, so there's been a lot of effort trying to make judgments consistent in the sense that you do not want to depend. You do not want your punishment to depend on the judge you happen to have on the day. On the other hand, consistency always reflects the majority opinion. And so if you're making it consistent across the board, you could be hushing sort of minorities' opinions and other type of diversity in opinions that in some contexts are actually very important because they could be leading to change in the long run. So I think that that's kind of the places where somebody can say, oh, you think you're being fair because you're being consistent, but actually you've been unfair because you now ignored the very few judges from these communities that were actually representing different voices. Even if they're not consistent, they're like desirable part of change.
Oh, I see. This is how like our understanding of fairness evolves, and even we cannot like require or we should check if like our like sustainable judgment is still fair enough or not. So any questions? Yeah. About AI and machine learning in particular bias results, and which of the actors in the food chain have been liable?
The short answer is it's very tricky. Because legislation we have around discrimination is very much aimed at human decision making. And discrimination requires, you need to prove a lot, if that makes sense, to may have a discrimination case. And legislation that specifically thinks about AI bias is only coming into the world now. So the AI EU Act, for example, is starting to take that into place. But they're not really equivalent. And so I think it's been really hard to make the case. There's been some things like facial recognition where you could make a very good case for the system itself being discriminatory, but it's still really hard to prove that a specific officer made a specific arrest based on that. They can always tell you that they overridden that bias because of human decision making. So yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. I still kind of struggle to understand the concept of algorithmic bias, apart from one example that we discussed about how you design a loss function. Are there any, other relevant examples just to, because also in my mind, algorithms by design are kind of agnostic. So I cannot, imagine gradient descent to be biased, by itself. And then second question, you mentioned positive action, right? Positive actions being adopted in certain cases, but in the previous, in the rest of the day, we discussed several times about learning being an emergent property in extremely complex, systems. So problems such as verifiability, reachability, task completion by complex neural networks is actually, they're huge unknowns, and it's a very active field of theoretical and not only theoretical research. So how do you ensure that positive actions, so-called, are not, causing unexpected, but potentially totally unexpected results and totally unexpected consequences? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I would like to start by saying that a standard definition of bias is you can take it as any unfair discrepancy in the predictions. And this is what is bias in the general way of definition in a different context. One example, you can see it, for instance, in different levels in healthcare. Let me put it in healthcare, where you go to the hospital and then you have like a particular population acquiring the data there in the hospital. Then you train the model, and then you take this model that is learned with this particular distribution of the data, and you take it to a different hospital, even if it's not a different demographic location or geographic location, in a different hospital. So, or in a different geographical location. So if you ask the model to predict with a different type of data which is not having seen there, you have the so-called like this discrepancy in the predictions, and this is given by the data itself. So you learned, the model learned to a particular distribution that is geographically, there is a particular population, and then is not able to generalize well to the next population. So this is, that's like in data, and also as well in your sampling bias, but in the data itself, because it's acquired with a different population. Yes, so I will say that's another example. So you have some also as well, what I mentioned before, bias in labeling. So if again in healthcare, you say expert label if it's cancer or not cancer, usually this is highly uncertain to say, they might say we need to call a second or third reader to say to make sure that it's cancer or not cancer. So this is a label that you say, okay, this sample is associated with this label that is cancer, but perhaps it's not cancer. So the model is learning to associate this label with this kind of sample. So you are having this kind of confirmation bias, saying the error that is in during the training at the beginning will be continue propagating because you are learning in something that is incorrect. As an example.
I have another one just quickly because I mentioned the hiring model. So when you have a model that learns specifically to penalize CVs with the word women in them, it's originally because you had a biased data set. But once this has been learned, this is now a bias in the model itself. Does that make sense? I think your second action about positive action. So positive action, again, this is sort of a term that comes from the humanly defined legalization around discrimination. So it's not applicable to every algorithmic situation. It is applicable predominantly to decision makings that are about resource allocations for people. So credits, so loan applications, university resources. It's not something that can be trivially kind of expanded to any type of models.
Yeah, just my 2 cents. So I kind of agree with you. So it depends on what people mean by algorithmic, right? If the algorithm is in the learning part, then I don't think that there's any bias coming from there, because everything depends on how you define the features, and the algorithm is blind to the semantics of the features. But if by algorithmic you mean the algorithm that takes the decision once it's learned, then of course it's kind of trivial to say that it's algorithmic bias. Bias is always in the algorithm that takes the decision. There's a bias, but it's kind of a very, it's not very informative to say. So my position is always I think it's almost everything comes from the data, not from the algorithms. That's my view.
But in this situation, for example, imagine that you have a convolutional architecture, and then for some reason you constrain it for some particular family of convolutions. For example, you cannot have convolution which helps you to find the angles on your images. And then this might be seen as an algorithmic bias. So you cannot learn some classes which can be differentiated with angles.
But it's a bias that was put there by the people, the person who designed the system, not by the learning algorithm.
Yes.
It's not backpropagation that created the bias.
Yes, but it's on the level of architecture of the model, not the training procedure.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And not in the data. So it's just like some architectural
person, architecture, of course. But when I think of algorithm, I always think optimization.
Yeah, for example, we have transformers now, and maybe they have some limitations which makes them biased towards some particular predictions. But maybe we just don't know these limitations.
I mean, this is, again, it's really hard to separate completely from the data, but I do have a nice example of that. So I don't know how many of you tried to go to an LLM of your choice and ask them about yourself. So sometimes it's going to go, I don't know who this person is. Sometimes it's going to make up a whole new bio for you. I decided that my partner was a famous Czech mathematician. He is Czech, but that's all. But sometimes, and this is a really interesting case, you are going to get your own bio, but it can be imperfect, as in some facts can be changed. And what's really interesting is what facts get changed. And I think this is, again, a combination of the data and the learning mechanism, because what's going to happen is sometimes the things that's going to change, it will take your unique story and kind of make it more mainstream, because it is doing some sort of averaging property. So there was one example of an academic that went to a community college, which is pretty unusual, and then became an academic. And so I think it was ChatGPT, but I'm not sure. When it spat out her bio, it corrected it that she went to an Ivy college for her undergrad, because it seemed much more probable, I suppose, So this is something to do with the learning algorithm, but of course it's because all the bias it's seen, it just kind of, it's also part of the data, but it's combination of the process and the data. And I think it's interesting because it's also a very subtle bias where it's like minor changes, but it's sort of making things a little bit more mainstream and kind of erasing.
Does that, can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Oh.
sure.
Counted bias, or is it an error? Not all errors are bias.
I mean, that's a great question, but I think it's a bit of both, right? It's like an error, but it's not a random error. It's sort of it's sort of an error that is more in a certain direction than just random.
Systematic.
It's I think LLMs generally kind of has to make us really reconsider what we talk about when we say bias, because there are a lot of kind of gray areas. So
Any other questions from the audience? Yep. Just wait for a mic.
It's just an observation about the algorithmic bias, in that even the choice of saying I'm going to optimize something privileges certain types of solution. You might choose to have a satisfaction type of way of optimizing, which says I'm going to get a good enough solution, and that provides a much wider space of solutions which you can then explore in an ensemble type way as described. So that process of saying I'm going to optimize, I'm going to use a gradient descent, which is again very closely connected to what loss function you choose, does generate algorithmic, in my opinion, generates an algorithmic bias that's irrelevant to the data that you're providing. So I think we can be somewhat naive if we just say, okay, it's not my bit that's being biased, it's them over there that's generating the data.
I think, sorry, you were saying? Oh, I think that's more getting into like a problem setup, which is something I'm actually super interested in, because I think that can have a huge impact, but is often not considered. Sometimes people do go for optimizing the most obvious things to optimize, but think about Google Maps, for example, right? So the things you tend to optimize for is speed or short distance, which are super sensible metrics. But if sometimes you're going from walk to A to B, maybe what you want is the nicest, most scenic route, especially if you're like a tourist somewhere and you don't have that option. And that will be in a way a lot less trivial to optimize because you won't have data, but it doesn't mean that sometimes that's not like the most desirable solution.
Okay, so let's switch to the final part of our discussion. So countermeasures, what we should do with all these biases. So certainly, if we have some balance between our efficiency or producing models and application of our models, and as well as trying to make them as fair as possible. So how we can also mitigate risks from biases, and as well as find this right balance in doing.
Thank you. So for my personal point of view, there will be key factors. The first one is privacy on the data. So this is quite important to report. Then you have not only as a bias privacy, but also as well monitoring the algorithmic approach as well, to know exactly where the decision-making process and understand what's happening. That is somehow connecting with explainability as well. Mm-hmm. So I would say privacy, transparency in the algorithmic approach is a second key point as well to avoid biases. And the third point as well is regarding about, there is an inherent bias from human that counts labeling, acquisition, and all in the process. So monitoring as well your labels. That will be tricky points that I will say.
So I think, the sort of algorithmic fairness community has done a lot in the next few years, and there's a lot of technical solutions, and a lot of them are appropriate in different situations. But what I would say might sound a bit hippie, but I think there is no replacement to being thoughtful about what you're doing. And so part of that is really trying to consider the problem from many angles, really think about the data you have, understand how it was collected, trying to think, not everything you can fix, but you can start by mapping out all the potential issues and thinking, how do we evaluate? How do we monitor it? Is this still something we want to do, giving all those problems? And just a funny anecdote, because a couple weeks ago, I gave a talk about machine learning in police in number 10. And at the end of the talk, someone came to me about, right, like short answer, what do we need to do it better? And my answer was, be thoughtful. And he basically went, oh, come on. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but like, there's no quick fix. Like, even with all the things that's been invented and bred, there's no like quick fix that you can say, oh, here's this toolbox. If you apply this, you're good to go.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's the main message is that companies who use machine learning decisions that affect people should be aware that they affect people. And so they should be thoughtful about the whole process. But having said that, of course, there are technical things that you can do, right? When you're designing a machine learning pipeline to attack some problem, you can design it to satisfy fairness measures in addition to accuracy or whatever, or false positive rates or whatever you care about. So there are learning algorithms that allow you to put those constraints on fairness measures. Of course, what fairness measures and what you mean by fairness, what kind of fairness you care about, of course, that needs to be decided by humans. And an interesting area of research, I think it's not very old, but it's very important in this area where there are machines making decisions about people, is human AI collaboration. So in medical area, for example, it's common to have deferral and learning how to defer a decision that the machine considers too hard and defer it to a doctor. Or in the credit card transaction fraud detection, there's this case. So some borderline cases are deferred to humans. And this again is to study the systems that have this human AI collaboration. From a fairness point of view, it's really tricky because it depends a lot on which human it will be deferred to, which depends on sometimes circumstantial aspects, such as who's on duty at that time. And you don't know if that person has a bias or not and what kind of bias that person has. So these complex systems that include AI and humans, it's very important that they are studied and considered and designed appropriately from this perspective, because human decision making in history was never very thoughtful about this fairness aspect, and the fact that now it's being integrated with AI decisions has brought these aspects to the limelight of discussion, and I think it's a very important aspect.
I can't agree more, actually, and I think that a lot of times it's sort of human in the loop is seen like a always solution. It's like, oh, don't worry that we have bias in this facial recognition system because a human validates. So I'm like, well, if you've never evaluated the system as a whole, which is, as you say, it can be very tricky. You don't know that it improved the situation. It could be making it worse. It could be that actually your automated system is less biased than your combined system. One thing I do want to add, actually, is that one thing I really believe in is things like participatory development. So when we said about, defining what fairness is and like what the goals are, it really matters who you are. So if it's just you, so one thing that happens a lot, I think, especially like civil service, is that the people that design these systems maybe go to a consultancy and they're like really high up, they're not the users. And so a lot of times the user gets this new system, they've not been consulted, and whoever developed it didn't really have an understanding of the decision-making process, and then you can have a lot of mess. So it's really important that whoever is considering and thinking and being thoughtful about these issues includes sort of both people who are the human decision maker in general that understand this process, but also the people that are affected by it, and people that it's very hard. I think people tend to think they're more empathetic than what they are. They feel like they can imagine what it is to have a certain disability, or they can imagine what it is to be in a different race or gender. You can't, not in an effective way. So it is really important to bring people to the table that can help you.
So I would like to extend on what it was said before. I mean, we are talking about systems that are, we aim for open research, right? But there are deep learning models, particularly that are commercialized. So the users, for instance, medical doctors, physicians, or so on, to understand what is happening, I believe is really hard, because still, in the end of the day, you have only not what we know about traditional mathematics or traditional inverse problems, but actually only a black box. It's hard to explain to the medical doctors what is happening. So explain it to the medical doctors or expert is really hard. But in my point of view, what you need to do for biases is actually, for any domain, not only healthcare, every single domain, privacy in the data. Make sure that every single person, if particularly involves human in the data, are really private and they have the consent. This is, I think, one of the key parts. To understand what is doing the system, I believe is hard, particularly because deep learning is, in the end of the day, a black box, and understand or translate that to a medical doctor, for instance, can be through explainability. So bias in these decision makings, how to improve to make more understandable the outcome is also well important, but still challenging. Yeah.
Building on what you said on explainability, I think counterfactual fairness can be a really effective way, even to just reflect to people their own biases, or like so, you know, let's say that you're a human decision maker and you can actually look at all the decisions you made in the last 1,000 decisions, and now they're going to show you, like, based on some split, oh, what's the counterfactual decision? Make this decision if this person's a man, but now if this was a woman, the probability of your own decision. It can be a really powerful tool to use, both for evaluation and also for like explainability when it comes to bias, for people to like go, oh, okay, I keep everything the same, but I'm flipping this one switch and the decision changes. It's a pretty powerful tool.
You know that in many research areas and in many applications areas which are ethics sensitive, we have something like ethics panels and something like this to approve studies or to approve application of something. And do you think that we need to like adopt this practice for AI models, or maybe we need something else? So is it good practice or not in terms of application, considering some AI applications, ethical sensitive AI applications, going through these panels to be approved?
I would say so, right? Like it's I don't know about panels, but there certainly must be some process that approves from the fairness and bias perspective, some machine learning system that's going to make decisions about people that affect people's lives, like in pharmaceutical industry or cars or whatever. You cannot just build a car and start selling it, right? Same would apply, I guess, for machine learning.
Actually, it's quite interesting because that, for instance, in very sensitive domains like healthcare, there is an ethical panel that if you want access to the data, you need to go through all this ethical approval process, which I believe is really good because there are really sensitive, these are really sensitive domain. It's different that you collect images from cats and dogs from internet, that you say, okay, I want to solve a problem that is related to real world data that is in the hospital. So in that sense, yes, I believe healthcare is this domain is doing a good path to work towards that. If you want the data, you need to fill up and follow all the ethical approval guidance, and then you can get the data, and everything is protected. All users, all patients that are collected the data from are protected in this sense. However, many other domains are open. Some of them you can find domains like natural images that you can collect for internet. Who protect that? Who approve it? That's an open question. There is not such approval. Apparently, like what happens if you want data from hospitals, that you need to go through this process. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting actually, because the different industries have established standards already, and that really impacts. So West Midlands Police, for example, has an ethics committee, but it is specifically around sort of new algorithmic things. If the police just want to have a new procedure that has nothing to do with algorithms or tech, they don't have to ask anyone for approval. So it is kind of interesting how these things are getting established in the context of AI, but sometimes it is pretty critical to remember that many times you're replacing one process in another, and the new process could not be, is sometimes not perfect, but it could still be a big improvement on the previous process. And so the scrutiny does need to keep in mind what it is replacing. And healthcare, I think, already has a lot of much better standards. What you said about the data is, I mean, things, for example, like GDPR don't really apply to criminal justice. You can't just phone the police and say, hey, please delete all the data you have on me. And so it is tricky in every domain, is kind of different. I think generally speaking, yes, it's great that there is scrutiny, and that specifically, I think, you know, if those kind of panels publish their meeting minutes, and so it also gives the public some like ability to see, oh, how is the scrutiny happening? Are we happy with it? But it can end up being almost comical, the difference between the level of process for this type of decision making versus the regular type of decision making that has no oversight whatsoever.
Yeah, but given current moment, if we are gradually moving into the like regulation part, so right now, do you think is the regulation is sufficient enough, or it's too high, so too strong to develop this model, or it's too weak? So what is your opinion?
I mean, is there regulation right now?
I don't know.
place?
It's the question for it, or it's no regulation at all.
So to the best of my, there's incoming regulation. It is in process, but I think right now there isn't anything. I can definitely tell you that if a police force wants to deploy a new AI system tomorrow, they don't have to ask anyone. They don't have to tell anyone. There is no regulation on them. The reason that they've been trying hard to be good about this is probably because they're all very good people, but also because there has been a lot of press scrutiny on this field. So there's been pressures from things that are not regulations, and there's been a lot of backlash that has been very problematic. So there are already forces that are making things, sort of processes, to be more formulated. But in terms of regulation, I'm not aware of any.
It's pretty surprising that in police we have no regulation at all.
Yeah, it is.
And what's about healthcare?
Well, first of all, in the general context, I believe that we hear announced big news about many countries doing some committee about ethical approvals and regulations that I believe that will be in place in, we don't know when exactly, but definitely like what type of regulations can be done. I mean, as an example, you have a machine learning AI system and you want to put it in the hospital. That is not happening. That why is the reason? Because this is, again, a very sensitive area. If you go to put a deep learning system in a different area or a different industry, like for instance, automobile design or so, that might be more a smooth transition. But if you want to put this deep learning model in the hospital, that takes several years. And why is this happening? Because doctors, or well, general practitioner or physicians, they need to go through first training, learning curve about the system. That's one. Second of all, also as well, the fact that if you put a new system there, you don't know if it's, you are risking a lot of things. For instance, if a patient is misdiagnostic and is no, or the prognosis is not good, who takes responsibility? So all of these open questions and dealing with ethical and as well who takes responsibility, that's why, for instance, in the healthcare, you cannot go tomorrow and put a deep learning system. That for that happening takes years for trial and so on. So that's different.
Yeah, just cover. I think at the moment it's determined by industry standards about new systems and procedures, and not anything that's like blanket to do with the fact that it's AI.
Yeah, and yeah, I totally agree with what you said. So I think the medical industry is a good example of very careful deployment. but on the other hand, it's very slow, right? So it's probably at this moment not compatible with the speed at which AI is developing, and maybe we're losing on some of the good things that AI could be doing for medical decision making, because it's too slow. I don't know if you should err on the side of being too careful. Maybe that's the right way to go.
So we need less we need try to incentivize maybe less regulation comparing like AI system with other medical methods. This is what you are saying, like that we are it's still unknown, and then maybe it's not that harmful.
Well, I'm not saying exactly that, but in the US, there are already, I think, several, I don't know the number, but dozens of FDA approved medical devices that use machine learning. And there are ways to to kind of not shortcut the approval, but use them in a more controlled and together with human decision making that makes it more useful and does not completely rely on the automatic decision, and that can make it more useful. So in other areas, so AI has the potential to be used in so many areas. In so many areas, it's being used and not regulated, like in, I don't know, social media, and it affects so much society, and there's no regulation whatsoever. So I think that's more for me. It worries me more than specific application. People, it's done by professionals. It's like you were saying, it depends on the industry. In some industries that use AI extensively with a huge impact on society have absolutely zero regulation and will never have.
And zero accountability. Just saying. I want to say it comes back to something you mentioned earlier, actually today. I think this is also affected by the fact that people don't seem to have the same sensitivity to mistakes done by humans or by machine, right? If a surgeon makes a mistake and something happens, then okay, there'll still be an inquiry if he slept enough, if there was a problem. But go, okay, well, people are doing the same thing. If the same thing happened, but it was a result of a robotic arm taken the same by the public, and that is people would have different opinions to whether. I don't think that's a consensus thing, right? So, but it is a reality that I think that people that are or are cautious about it are aware of, and they're trying to accommodate with this. But I think similar to other stuff with industry standards, who is accountable also really changes. Like social media, there's definitely evidence that there's a lot of impact on things like teenage anorexia and things like that, but no one is like it is not in terms of accountability. So people would be like, oh, social media is a contributor, but no firm is going to be taken to court to it because the causal link is never strong enough to be proven in court. Okay, I'm not saying they're trying, but it's not as trivial as a robotic arm was operating on a person in a surgery room, and then you could potentially be like, this is why this happened, and this was the consequence.
So what do you think about if AI can help us handle these ethical issues, and fairness issues? So just as I'm doing NLP, and I can say that, for example, ChatGPT, large language model, will be like given correct description of some like ethical or like moral system or ethical system, might produce better ethical judgment than average human. So because it averages, as you said, it like averages everything. And if you properly condition it on some specific culture or some specific situation, it might give you good advice how to handle situation. What do you think about like this application of large language models? Might be they useful or not as a advice in these situations?
I mean, large language model are like a training topic now, right? It's like a
Yeah,
major
sure.
thing. But in my personal point of view, I believe that for sensitive topics like making big decisions or so, I believe that AI is not to replace it, but help making perhaps faster decision as any other model for diagnostic, for instance, in healthcare. So I believe that large language models have a lot of potential. Yet I believe that a committee with a diversity, multidisciplinary teams like policymakers, ethical approvals, and so on, machine learning, mathematicians, and so on, that will be also as well necessary, not only allow the large language model to make the final decision
But
at this point.
should we reserve one place for LLM on this panel, on this committee?
So, well, we hope that still AI now in the future, it helps instead of replacing, but I believe that definitely large language model have a lot of potential now.
So I'm not in favor of automated ethical agents personally. I can give you several reasons. One is, what you said, like you'll give better ethical advice. I don't know how better is defined in that sense. Is the fact that this is like the majority opinion better? Or would you go to an ethics expert? Will he give you better? Or is it better to ask somebody who's been in the situation and already knows how things can pan out? Better is very hard to define, and so because of that, very hard to optimize. And the other thing is, like, I think it is inherently a human conversation because we are mostly the ones impacted by it, and it is a changing, evolving conversation. And so deciding that it should be handed to some, a form because there is one better way of doing that decision making is something that that scares me as a future. And unless you could somehow prove that there is some unequivocal way to say this is a better ethical decision. But I think most ethical, so I did actually grade someone's thesis that was talking about automated moral agent, poor guy. But I think it's like, usually you have to stick to one metric, right? So you have to stick to things like there's trolley problems or some famous ethical problems where you have to stick to one metric. So you can say, I'm minimizing the number of life losses. So if you stick to one metrics, you can say A is better than B. But that is not necessarily the right metric. And I think there's almost never a situation where you know for sure what is the right metric. And that's why it's, I would rather not see that happening. That's the short answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would not automate, I would not delegate ethical decisions to an LLM or whatever, but maybe it could be used as part of a committee that trying to think about it, because sometimes, say GPT-4 read probably all of the ethics books ever written, all of the millions and millions of lines of ethical discussions. So it has a lot of, I don't like the word knowledge about LLMs, but it has a lot of stuff inside that comes from there. And so sometimes it gives you perspectives that people have not thought about. And so it could be useful for a discussion. But again, ethics is essentially at the end an issue of choosing. There must be a choice. There's no objective better. It always is a question of choice, and in the end, it's up to humans to make that choice. What counts as good.
Yeah,
and although we tend to kind of see ourselves as utilitarian and think that if you kill 5 people, it's better than killing 10. When faced with real situation, we end up mixing different ways of acting, and we also deontological, and we also sometimes depend on if you're acting or if you're just being passive. So it's way more complicated than just calculus.
Yeah. Thank you. So any questions, maybe 1-2 questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. Do you a regulation at the level of a country, of the world, of artificial intelligence systems that determine the life of people, like, for example, with the environment now, no? That some commissions say whether this car is safe or not, or you think that it will happen just like with computers, that everybody can use them in whatever application with no regulation?
If it's a global thing around the world, I have zero hope that that will ever happen in that or anything else. So I don't really have a lot of hope for global rules for humanity.
Country?
Even at the country level, even in Europe, like been around for I don't know how many years the AI Act has been discussed, like I don't know, a long time, and then suddenly it's surprised with the appearance of large language models, and everything almost became obsolete that was being discussed at that. Not obsolete, it reminded legislators that they need to hurry up. That's what I would say.
Yeah, the EUA actually, I mean, when you read it, it's very, very influenced by problems that were there like 5 years ago. And yeah, because regulation is sort of slow compared to what's happening. So like the harms that are sort of being exposed now, they kind of scramble to try and address it, but it's actually really non-trivial.
I believe it's going to take time, but now, for instance, we see university here. If we want to do a collaboration, we need to do this UK official control list. Say, are you going to export anything related to keywords like algorithmic techniques, hardware, software? So there is some steps taking now place where before we say, okay, we have a research collaboration agreement, it's signed, but now there is a different protocol happening here, at least this year, saying, are you going to collaborate? If the university needs to approve it, you need to check this official UK control export. So I believe for globally or country-wise will take time, but we can see now that some changes that we don't see before now, like filling up like from a simple control list to say, is these keywords appears in your research? If not, okay, but if yes, you need to go to ask a license for that. So for a collaboration. So we see some changes now. How it's going to be in the future is unknown, but I believe it's going to take some baby steps now.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvester.
Just a really other quick comment that we don't have time to get into, but China's general approach to regulating AI is, for example, completely different from the EU one, which is a really interesting thing to kind of look at, that they're also regulated it, but from like a completely different perspective.
So probably the last question. If no more questions, then let's thank our panel. Have a good discussion.
For sharing the panel. That brings us to the close of the day or the academic proceedings. But this means that the thing that you guys actually signed up for can't start, namely the drinks and the canapes. They start now, and so the item not here, basically, so that we form a party and then go there. But before we include this, we thank all the panelists to be here to the entire day, as well as the chairs, as well as the speakers, and you for all your lovely questions. It has been entertaining and very answer. Thank you very much. Also, special thanks to Angelica and Christine Monteverder from the Gateway, who basically had to stop the barrage and help the mails to get us in the effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you.